Robert Harrison was not the kind of man who scared easily. He had spent 30 years working with cattle on his ranch in Montana, dealing with harsh winters, wild animals, and all the tough situations that come with ranch life. But in the summer of 1987, he made a decision that would nearly cost him his life. Robert had always been a man with big dreams. His cattle ranch was doing well, but he wanted something more. He had heard stories about the rich grasslands in Brazil and the possibility of breeding exotic cattle that could handle different climates. The idea excited him. If he could find good land there and bring back new breeding stock, his ranch could become something truly special. So he packed his bags, said goodbye to his family, and flew to Brazil. The first few weeks went smoothly. He visited several farms, talked to local ranchers, and learned about the cattle business in South America. But then he heard about land deep in the Amazon rainforest, land that was cheap, untouched, and perfect for what he had in mind. Everyone told him not to go. The hotel manager in the small town warned him. The local farmers shook their heads. Even the 2 guides he hired seemed nervous about the journey. But Robert was stubborn. He had come all this way, and he was not going to turn back without at least seeing what was out there. The journey started well enough. They left the small town in an old Jeep, driving for hours on rough dirt roads until the road simply ended. Then they continued on foot, cutting through thick jungle with machetes. The heat was unbearable. Robert had never experienced humidity like this. His shirt was soaked with sweat within minutes, and the insects were everywhere, biting any exposed skin they could find. His 2 guides, local men who knew the forest, led the way. They moved quickly and quietly, always watching the trees and the ground. Robert tried to keep up, but the pace was exhausting. They walked for hours each day, stopping only to drink water from streams and eat the dried meat and bread they had packed. On the 3rd day, everything changed. They came across strange marks on the trees. The guides stopped immediately, their faces going pale. They spoke rapidly to each other in Portuguese, pointing at the marks. Robert did not understand what they were saying, but he could feel their fear. One of the guides turned to him and said in broken English that these were territorial markers. An isolated tribe lived in this area, and they did not welcome outsiders. The guide explained that this tribe had no contact with the modern world and could be dangerous. They needed to turn back immediately, but Robert argued with them. They had come so far. Just a few more miles, he insisted. He would pay them extra. But the guides refused. They had families to go back to, they said. No amount of money was worth risking their lives. That night, while Robert slept, the guides made their decision. When he woke up in the morning, they were gone. They had taken most of the supplies with them, leaving him with only a small bag of food, 1 water bottle, and a compass. No map, no radio, just the dense jungle in every direction. Robert felt panic rise in his chest for the first time. He was alone in one of the most remote places on Earth. He had no idea which direction would lead him back to civilization. The jungle all looked the same, thick green walls of vegetation everywhere he turned. He decided to follow the stream they had been walking beside. Water flows downward, he told himself. Eventually it would lead to a river, and rivers lead to people. It was his only logical option. For 2 days he walked. His food ran out. His water bottle was empty, so he drank straight from the stream, knowing it was risky but having no choice. The jungle seemed to close in around him. Every sound made him jump. He heard animals moving through the bushes, saw snakes hanging from branches, and felt things crawling on him in the darkness when he tried to sleep. On the 3rd day alone, Robert started feeling sick. It began with chills, even though the air was hot and sticky. Then came the fever. His head pounded and his body ached in ways he had never experienced. He tried to keep walking, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. By afternoon, he could barely stand. His vision was blurry and he was shaking uncontrollably. He knew these were signs of something serious, probably malaria or some other tropical disease. Without medicine, without help, he was in real trouble. He collapsed near the riverbank, too weak to go any further. The ground was muddy and uncomfortable, but he did not have the strength to move. His mind started playing tricks on him. He thought he saw his ranch back home, his wife standing on the porch. He could almost hear his cattle in the distance. Robert Harrison, the tough Montana rancher who had survived blizzards and stampedes, who had built a successful business with his own 2 hands, lay dying in a jungle thousands of miles from home. He thought about his family and how they would never know what happened to him, He would just disappear, another foolish foreigner who did not listen to warnings. As darkness fell and his fever burned hotter, Robert closed his eyes. He was certain he would not wake up again. The jungle would claim him, just like it had claimed so many others who had ventured too deep into its heart. But fate had other plans for Robert Harrison. Plans that involved 3 women from a world he never knew existed, and a debt that would change all of their lives forever. The first thing Robert felt was cool wetness on his forehead. Then came the smell, something earthy and bitter like crushed leaves mixed with mud. His body felt heavy, like someone had wrapped him in thick blankets. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids would not cooperate. Everything was dark and confusing. Slowly, sounds began to reach him. Voices speaking in a language he had never heard before. Soft, rhythmic words that seemed to flow like water. Then gentle hands touching his arm, pressing something against his skin. The smell grew stronger, and he felt a cool paste being spread across his chest and forehead. When Robert finally managed to open his eyes, he had no idea where he was. The ceiling above him was made of dried palm leaves and wooden poles. Smoke drifted lazily through the air from a small fire in the corner. The walls were not really walls at all, just woven mats that let light filter through the gaps. He turned his head slowly, and that is when he saw them. 3 women sat near him, talking quietly to each other. They were unlike anyone he had ever seen. Their skin was darker than his, painted with red and black patterns. They wore simple clothes made from plant fibers and had straight black hair that hung down their backs. When they noticed he was awake, they stopped talking and looked at him with careful, curious eyes. Robert tried to sit up, but pain shot through his entire body. He groaned and fell back down. One of the women, the oldest of the 3, quickly moved to his side. She gently pushed him back down and said something in her language. Her tone was firm but kind, the way a mother speaks to a sick child who is trying to get out of bed too soon. The woman reached for a clay bowl next to her and brought it to his lips. The liquid inside smelled terrible, like rotten plants mixed with dirt. Robert wanted to refuse, but his throat was so dry it hurt. He took a small sip and immediately regretted it. The taste was even worse than the smell, bitter and thick. But the woman insisted, holding the bowl steady until he drank more. Over the next few hours, Robert drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time he woke up, at least one of the 3 women was there. They changed the poultices on his skin, gave him more of the horrible-tasting medicine, and helped him drink water. They worked with quiet efficiency, as if they had done this many times before. Days passed in a blur. Robert learned later that he had been unconscious for almost a week before he finally started to understand what was happening around him. The fever that had nearly killed him was slowly losing its grip, thanks to whatever medicine these women were giving him. As his mind cleared, he began to notice the differences between the 3 women. The oldest one, who seemed to be in her 30s, had a serious face and moved with confidence. She was clearly the leader of the group. The second woman was younger, maybe in her mid-20s, with gentler features and sad eyes. The third was the youngest, probably around 20, and she had a long scar running down the left side of her face from her eye to her jaw. Robert tried to communicate with them using hand gestures. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly, "Robert." Then he pointed to them with a questioning look. The oldest woman seemed to understand. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Mira. Then she pointed to the other 2. "Kaya," she said, indicating the sad-eyed woman. "Tani," pointing to the youngest with the scar. Through these simple exchanges, Robert began to piece together what had happened. These women had found him by the river, nearly dead from fever. They had brought him back to their village and had been caring for him ever since. They had saved his life using plants and methods passed down through generations. But as grateful as Robert was, he also noticed something troubling. The rest of the village did not seem happy about his presence. When he was strong enough to sit up and look outside the hut, he saw other members of the tribe watching him with hostile eyes. The men especially seemed angry. They would stand in groups talking and gesturing toward the hut where he was staying. Mira, Kaya, and Tani seemed to understand this too. Robert noticed how they would position themselves between him and the entrance whenever other tribe members came near. They were protecting him, but it was clear this was causing problems for them. The women took turns caring for him, one always staying nearby while the others went to do their work in the village. They brought him food, mostly a thick soup made from roots and small pieces of meat that he could not identify. It was not good, but it was nutrition, and he ate it gratefully. At night, when the village was quiet, Robert would hear the women talking softly to each other. He could not understand their words, but he could hear the worry in their voices. Sometimes they would look at him and then at each other, and he could see the concern on their faces. Robert realized he was putting them in danger somehow. His presence was creating conflict, and these three women who had saved his life were facing consequences because of him. The guilt weighed on him almost as much as the sickness had. 2 weeks after waking up in that hut, Robert was finally strong enough to stand and walk a few steps. His legs were shaky and he had lost a lot of weight, but he was alive. Every morning he looked at Mira, Kaya, and Tani and felt overwhelming gratitude. These women owed him nothing. They had never met him before. Yet they had risked something precious to save a stranger. He tried to show his appreciation in small ways. He would smile at them, help clean the clay bowls they used, and attempt to learn words in their language. They seemed to appreciate his efforts, and sometimes Tani, the youngest, would even smile back at him, the scar on her face crinkling. But the tension in the village continued to grow. Robert could see it in how the other villagers behaved. The men would walk past the hut and spit on the ground. Women would whisper and point. Even children seemed to have been told to stay away. One evening, an older man with feathers in his hair and elaborate body paint came to the hut. He spoke loudly and angrily, pointing at Robert and then at Mira. The three women bowed their heads and said nothing, but Robert could see Mira's hands shaking. The man left, but his message was clear. Robert was not welcome, and the women were in trouble for helping him. That night, Robert lay awake thinking. He was getting stronger, but he was still too weak to travel through the jungle alone. Even if he could walk for hours, he had no idea which direction to go. He needed these women's help to survive, but his presence was clearly hurting them. What kind of man puts his saviors in danger? What kind of debt was this, where the person who owed everything was causing harm just by existing? These questions kept Robert awake as the sounds of the jungle night filled the air around him. Somewhere out there was his ranch, his family, his old life. But here, in this small hut in the middle of nowhere, 3 brave women had given him a second chance at life. Now he had to figure out how to repay that debt without destroying them in the process. As Robert grew stronger, he began to understand the world he had accidentally entered. The village was not permanent. It was a temporary settlement made of simple huts that could be packed up and moved when needed. About 40 people lived there, mostly families with children running around between the huts. Life in the village followed patterns that had probably not changed for hundreds of years. The men would leave early in the morning to hunt with bows and spears. The women would work together, gathering plants, preparing food, and taking care of children. Everyone had a role, and everyone knew exactly what they were supposed to do, except for Mira, Kaya, and Tani. Robert started to notice how differently they were treated compared to the other women in the village. They did not gather food with the other women. They ate separately after everyone else had finished. And they lived together in a hut at the edge of the village, away from the family groups. Through careful observation and the few words he had learned, Robert began to piece together their stories. Mira had been married once, but her husband had died several years ago in a hunting accident. In this tribe, a widow without children was considered unlucky. No man would marry her again, and she had no family to protect her. Kaya was barren. Robert learned this when he saw her watching the other women with their babies, her eyes full of longing. In a tribe where having children was everything, where your value was measured by how many sons and daughters you produced, being unable to have children made you worthless. The other women treated her with pity mixed with disgust, as if her condition might be contagious. And Tani, the youngest with the scar on her face, had received that mark in a fire when she was a child. The injury had healed, but the scar remained. In this tribe, physical beauty mattered for marriage, and the scar made her unmarriageable. No man wanted a wife who was marked. She would never have a husband, never have children, never have status in the community. These 3 women, rejected by their society for things beyond their control, had found each other. They lived together, worked together, and survived together in a world that had no place for them. They were the lowest members of the tribe with no protection and no future. Understanding this made Robert's heart heavy. These women had saved him knowing it would bring trouble. They had nothing to lose because they already had nothing. And now, because of him, even their small, difficult existence was being threatened. The man with the feathers, whose name Robert learned was the village chief, came to visit several more times. Each visit became more heated. Robert could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear from the chief's angry gestures and raised voice. The tribe was planning to move soon, probably to follow game animals or find better foraging areas. And Robert was a problem that needed to be solved before they left. One afternoon, Robert heard shouting from the center of the village. He was strong enough now to walk, so he carefully made his way to the edge of the hut to see what was happening. What he saw made his blood run cold. Mira was kneeling in the dirt while the chief and several other men stood around her yelling. Kaya and Tani stood nearby, their heads bowed, while women from the village watched from a distance. One of the men struck Mira across the face and she fell to the side but did not cry out. She simply got back to her knees and accepted the punishment. Robert started forward to help, but Tani saw him and quickly shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. She was warning him to stay hidden. If he came out now, it would only make things worse. He watched, feeling helpless and furious as the three women were publicly shamed for helping him. The punishment went on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When it was finally over, the women came back to the hut, and Robert could see fresh bruises on Mira's face. That night something happened that Robert would never forget. Unable to sleep, he was sitting by the fire when Mira came and sat across from him. She looked at him for a long moment, then began to speak. Robert could not understand her words, but he understood her tone. She was not angry at him. She was explaining something important. Using gestures and drawings in the dirt, Mira made him understand their situation. The tribe would move in a few days. There was a big gathering place where they would meet with other groups for trading and ceremonies. After that, they would travel to their hunting grounds deep in the forest, places so remote that Robert would never find his way out. She pointed to herself. Kaya and Tani then made a gesture like being pushed away. The three of them would not be going with the tribe. They were being left behind as punishment for bringing Robert to the village. In the jungle, alone, without the protection and resources of the tribe, they would not survive long. Robert felt sick. These women had saved his life, and now they were being sentenced to death because of it. It was completely wrong and unfair. But what could he do? He was still weak, still lost, still dependent on them for survival. He had no power here, no voice, no way to change what was happening. The next morning, Robert made a decision. Using gestures, he told Mira that he needed to speak with someone who could translate between Portuguese and her language. There had to be someone nearby, maybe from another tribe or a trading post, who could help them communicate. Mira seemed surprised but nodded slowly. She spoke with Kaya and Tani and they had a long discussion. Finally, Mira agreed. She told Robert through gestures that there was indeed a place, maybe 2 days' walk from here, where traders sometimes came. One of those traders might be able to help, but they would have to move fast. The tribe was leaving in 3 days. If they wanted to reach the trading place and get back before then, they needed to go immediately. And Robert would have to walk the whole way, even though he was still recovering. There was no other option. So they left that afternoon, the four of them walking through the jungle. Robert's legs were shaky, and he had to stop often to rest, but he pushed himself harder than he ever had before. These women had carried him when he was dying. Now it was his turn to be strong for them. They reached the trading post just before dark on the second day. It was just a small clearing with a wooden shelter where hunters and gatherers from different tribes would meet to exchange goods. An old man was there, someone who had lived between both worlds for decades. He spoke Portuguese and several tribal languages. Through this translator, Robert was finally able to have a real conversation with Mira, and what she told him confirmed his worst fears. The three of them were considered contaminated by their contact with him. The tribe believed that helping an outsider would bring bad spirits and bad luck. The women had to be cast out to protect the rest of the group, but as Robert listened, an idea began to form in his mind. It was crazy and controversial and maybe even wrong, but it might be the only way to save these three women who had saved him. He needed to think carefully about how to propose it, because once he spoke the words, there would be no going back. That night, sleeping in the rough shelter at the trading post, Robert Harrison made a choice that would change 5 lives forever. He would make an offer that would shock everyone who heard it, an offer that would be talked about and argued over for years to come. But first he had to convince Mira, Kaya, and Tani that what he was proposing was not just another form of imprisonment, but a chance at freedom they had never imagined possible. The morning sun was barely up when Robert sat down with the translator and the three women. The old translator, who said his name was Vicente, had agreed to help them communicate for a small payment. He seemed curious about this strange situation, this sick foreigner and three outcast women sitting in his trading post. Robert took a deep breath and began to explain his idea. He spoke slowly so Vicente could translate everything accurately. He wanted to make sure Mira, Kaya, and Tani understood every word of what he was proposing. He told them about his world, a place where women could own property, make their own choices, and live without needing a husband to give them value. He described his ranch, the vast open spaces of Montana, so different from the jungle they knew. He talked about schools where they could learn, hospitals that could heal any sickness, and a life where their past would not define their future. The three women listened with expressions that changed from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been hope. But Mira asked the obvious question through Vicente. How would this be possible? They could not just leave. The tribe would never allow it. And even if they could leave, they had no money, no way to travel to this distant world Robert described. This was the difficult part. Robert had been thinking about it all night, and he knew how terrible it would sound. But he also knew it might be their only chance. He explained that before he got sick, he had left supplies and money at a trading outpost a week's journey away. Valuable things like metal tools, medicine, cooking pots, cloth, and other goods that would be precious to the tribe. These items were worth several $1,000s in his world, but here in the jungle, they would be worth even more. He proposed offering all of these items to the chief in exchange for releasing the three women from the tribe. Essentially, he would buy their freedom. The translator's eyes went wide when he translated this. The three women looked shocked, then troubled. Mira spoke rapidly, her voice rising, and Vicente translated. She said this would make them like property, like things to be bought and sold. How was that different from slavery? How was that freedom? Robert had expected this reaction. He leaned forward and spoke earnestly, asking Vicente to translate his words exactly. He said he understood how it sounded and he hated it too, but they needed to see the bigger picture. In the eyes of the tribe, they already were property, the lowest property imaginable. They had no rights, no voice, no future. The tribe was going to abandon them to die. At least this way they would live, he continued explaining. Once they left the jungle and reached civilization, they would be free. Completely free. He would help them learn the language, help them understand the new world, and then they could choose their own paths. They could stay near him or they could go anywhere they wanted. They would owe him nothing except to live the lives they wanted to live. But he also told them honestly about the challenges. The outside world was confusing and sometimes cruel. Everything would be strange and frightening at first. People might not understand where they came from or treat them well. Learning to live there would be hard, maybe the hardest thing they ever did. He could not promise it would be better, only that it would be different and it would be their choice. The three women talked among themselves for a long time. Vicente listened but did not translate their private conversation. Robert sat quietly watching their faces. He could see the fear there, but also something else. A spark of possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the trap their lives had become. Finally, Mira spoke to Vicente, and he turned to Robert with a surprised expression. She wanted to know why Robert would do this. He owed them nothing now. They had saved his life, yes, but he had already brought them trouble. Why would he give away all his valuable supplies for them? Why not just save himself and leave them to their fate? Robert felt emotion rise in his throat. He told them that where he came from there was an old saying about saving someone's life. It meant you became responsible for that life. They had saved him, but that debt could not be repaid by just saying thank you and walking away. Not when he knew they would die because they helped him. He had money and resources. He had a world of opportunities waiting for him. What kind of man would he be if he used all that to save only himself? He also admitted something else. He had made bad choices that led him into this situation. He had ignored warnings, been stubborn and foolish, and nearly died because of it. But these three women had done nothing wrong. They were suffering not because of their own choices, but because of circumstances they could not control. If his bad choices had put him in a position to help fix some injustice in the world, then maybe something good could come from his mistakes. When Vicente finished translating, there was a long silence. Tanny, the youngest with the scar, had tears running down her face. Kaya was staring at the ground, her shoulders shaking, and Mira was looking at Robert with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. It was not gratitude exactly, and not trust either. It was something more complicated, a mixture of desperate hope and terrified uncertainty. Mira spoke again, and Vicente translated. She said that she and the others would agree to his plan, but only if he promised them one thing. They would not be his servants or his property. They would be free people who chose to accept his help. Could he promise that? Robert nodded firmly. Yes, he could promise that. In fact, he wanted them to promise themselves. They would make their own choices from now on. And if any of those choices meant leaving him behind once they were safe, that would be fine too. The next step was approaching the chief and the tribal elders with the offer. Vicente agreed to come with them and act as translator. He seemed intrigued by the whole situation and wanted to see how it would play out. The four of them, plus Vicente, made the journey back to the village. When they arrived, they found the village in the middle of preparations for the move. Huts were being dismantled, possessions were being packed into woven baskets, and there was an air of busy activity everywhere. The return of Robert and the three women caused quite a stir. People stopped what they were doing to stare. The chief was not happy to see them. He came striding over, shouting angrily, his feathered headdress bouncing with each step. But Vicente stepped forward and held up his hand, speaking in the chief's language. He explained that Robert wanted to make an offer, a trade, and that it would benefit the entire tribe. The chief's angry expression changed to curiosity. Trade was something he understood. Trade was how things worked between people and between tribes. Vicente explained that Robert had valuable goods cached at a distant trading post. Tools made of metal that never broke, medicine that could cure fevers and infections, cloth that was softer and stronger than anything they could make, pots for cooking that would last forever. The chief asked what Robert wanted in return. Vicente gestured to Mira, Kaya, and Tanny. He wanted the tribe to release these three women from all obligations and allow them to leave with him. They would go to his world, and the tribe would receive all the valuable trade goods. The reaction was immediate and intense. The elders began talking all at once. Some seemed interested, others angry. Women in the village whispered to each other. The chief stroked his chin, thinking hard. He asked Vicente several questions. How did he know Robert really had these goods? What if it was a trick? And why would anyone give so much for three women who were worth nothing? Vicente translated all of this back to Robert, who answered each question carefully. He had papers showing his supplies were at the trading post. Vicente could verify this. As for why he would trade so much for three women the tribe considered worthless, well, that was exactly the point. If they were truly worthless to the tribe, then the tribe was getting valuable goods for nothing. It was an excellent deal. The chief called a meeting of the elders and they talked for hours. The whole village waited to hear the decision. Robert, Mira, Kaya, and Tanny sat together outside the meeting place, not speaking, just waiting. The afternoon turned to evening and still the discussion continued. Finally, as the sun was setting, the chief emerged. Through Vicente, he announced his decision. The tribe would accept Robert's offer. They would send men with him to the trading post to verify the goods existed and bring them back. Once the goods were delivered, the three women would be released from the tribe. They would no longer be members of the community, and the tribe would have no further responsibility for them. It was done. The deal was made. Robert felt a mixture of relief and deep unease. He had just participated in what felt like buying human beings, even if the intention was to free them. It went against everything he believed in, yet here he was agreeing to it because there was no other option. That night, no one celebrated. The three women packed their few belongings in silence. The rest of the village avoided looking at them, as if they had already become ghosts. And Robert lay awake, wondering if he had just made the best decision of his life or the worst mistake. Only time would tell. The journey to the trading post took 6 days instead of the planned week, because Robert was still not at full strength. 4 men from the tribe came with them, strong hunters who watched Robert with suspicious eyes the entire way. Vicente also joined them to ensure the translation would be accurate and the trade would be fair. Mira, Kaya, and Tani walked together, speaking quietly among themselves. Robert noticed how they would sometimes look back over their shoulders, as if they were not quite sure this was really happening. They were leaving the only life they had ever known, walking toward a future they could not even imagine. When they finally reached the trading post where Robert had stored his supplies, he felt a wave of relief. Everything was still there, untouched in the locked storage room. The metal tools gleamed in the light when he opened the crates. There were machetes, axes, saws, and knives made of the finest steel. There were large cooking pots made of aluminum, lightweight but incredibly durable, bolts of cloth in bright colors that would seem like magic to people who only had rough plant fibers to work with. And medicine, bottles and bottles of antibiotics, painkillers, and fever reducers that could save countless lives. The tribal men's eyes went wide when they saw everything. Even though they tried to maintain their stern expressions, Robert could see their excitement. This was wealth beyond anything they had expected. The chief had made a very good deal and they knew it. But that was the point, Robert thought. He needed them to feel like they had won. He needed them to believe that trading 3 unwanted women for all these goods was the smartest decision they had ever made. Only then would they truly release the women without trying to bring them back later. They spent that night at the trading post, and in the morning, a ceremony was held. The tribal men had brought paint and special leaves to mark the occasion. Vicente explained that in their culture, major trades and agreements were always formalized with ceremony. It helped everyone remember that this was serious and binding. The chief had sent along a wooden staff carved with symbols, a representation of his authority. One of the men held this staff while speaking words in their language. Vicente translated. The man was formally declaring that Mira, Kaya, and Tani were no longer members of the tribe. All connections were broken. All obligations were ended. They were now outsiders, the same as Robert. Then it was Robert's turn. Vicente had helped him prepare words in the tribal language. Robert spoke them carefully, saying that he accepted responsibility for the 3 women and would take them from this place. In exchange, he gave all the trade goods to the tribe freely and without expectation of return. The ceremony felt strange and uncomfortable. Robert kept thinking about how wrong it would sound if he tried to explain this to anyone back home. But here, in this place, it was the only way. The tribe needed their ceremony, their formal process. It helped them understand that this was real and permanent. After the ceremony, the 3 women were each given a mark. One of the tribal men mixed ash with plant sap and drew a symbol on each woman's shoulder. Vicente explained that this mark meant they were no longer protected by tribal law. If they ever returned to tribal lands, they would be treated as strangers or possibly even as enemies. It was a mark of exile, of separation. The mark would fade over time, but its meaning would last forever. Robert watched Tani receive her mark and saw tears sliding down her scarred cheek. This was her home, her people, her language, her entire world. And now it was being taken away. Yes, the tribe had treated her badly. Yes, she had no future there. But it was still all she knew. Leaving it behind was terrifying. The trade goods were loaded onto the backs of the 4 tribal men. They were heavy, but the men did not complain. They were eager to return to their village and show everyone what they had received. Before they left, the oldest of the 4 men spoke to Mira. Vicente translated. The man said that she and the others had made a foolish choice. The outside world would destroy them. They would never belong there and they could never come back here. They would be lost forever, belonging nowhere. Mira looked the man in the eyes and responded in her own language. Vicente smiled slightly as he translated her words. She said that being lost in a new world was better than being found in an old one, where you were worth nothing. She would rather die free than live as less than human. The man shook his head and turned away. Within minutes, the 4 tribal men were gone, disappeared into the jungle with their valuable cargo, and just like that, the transaction was complete. Robert, Mira, Kaya, Tani, and Vicente stood in the clearing of the trading post. The silence felt heavy. Everything had changed in just a few moments. There was no going back now, not for any of them. Vicente broke the silence. He explained to Robert that the next part of the journey would be challenging in different ways. They would need to walk for about 2 weeks to reach the nearest town that had roads and vehicles. From there, they could travel to a city where Robert could contact his embassy and arrange to go home. But Vicente also warned him about something important. What Robert was doing, taking 3 indigenous women out of the jungle, would raise questions. Authorities might think he had kidnapped them or was trafficking them. He would need to be very careful about how he explained the situation. He would need documentation, proof that the women had chosen to come with him. Over the next 2 days, Vicente helped Robert prepare this documentation. They wrote down the story in Portuguese, explaining the situation as clearly as possible. All 3 women made their marks on the document, a sign that they agreed to what was written. Vicente signed as a witness. It was not perfect, but it was something. Vicente also spent time with the 3 women explaining what they would face. He had lived between both worlds, and he knew how shocking civilization could be for someone who had never seen it before. He warned them about cars that moved faster than any animal, buildings that reached toward the sky, thousands of people living together in one place, lights that turned night into day, sounds and smells and experiences that would overwhelm their senses. Robert watched as Mira, Kaya, and Tani listened to Vicente's warnings. They held hands, the 3 of them forming a small circle of support. Whatever came next, they would face it together. On the 3rd day, Vicente said goodbye. His work was done, and he needed to return to his own life. Before he left, he pulled Robert aside and spoke seriously. He told Robert that what he was doing was either very noble or very foolish, possibly both. These women were trusting him with their lives. He could not let them down. If he had any doubts, any second thoughts, now was the time to turn back. Robert looked at the 3 women sitting by the fire, talking quietly in their language. They had saved his life when they had every reason to let him die. They had sacrificed their place in their tribe for him. They were now facing complete uncertainty because they believed he would help them find something better. How could he possibly turn back now? He told Vicente that he had no doubts about helping them. His only doubts were about whether he was capable of helping them enough. But he would do his best and he would not abandon them. Vicente nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. He wished them all luck and disappeared down the jungle trail. And then there were 4. Robert Harrison, the Montana rancher who had nearly died from his own stubbornness. Mira, the widow with quiet strength. Kaya, the barren woman with sad eyes. And Tani, the scarred girl with surprising courage. 4 people whose paths should never have crossed, now bound together by an impossible situation and heading toward an uncertain future. Robert gathered them together and, using the few words they had taught each other and many hand gestures, tried to explain what would happen next. They would walk for many days. Then they would enter his world, a world completely different from anything they knew. Things would be confusing and frightening, but he would be with them every step of the way. The 3 women nodded. They understood, or at least they understood enough. Mira spoke, and even though Robert could not understand all her words, he understood her meaning. They were ready. They had already crossed the biggest threshold by leaving their tribe. Whatever came next could not be scarier than what they had already survived. That night, as they camped in the trading post for the last time before beginning their long walk to civilization, Robert made a promise to himself. He would not let these women down. He would help them build new lives even if it cost him everything he had. It was the least he could do for the 3 people who had given him back his life. The transaction was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. The first week of walking was the easiest part, which was saying something because it was not easy at all. Robert was still recovering his strength and the jungle terrain was brutal. But Mira, Kaya, and Tani knew how to travel through the forest. They knew which plants were safe to eat, how to find water, and how to avoid the dangerous animals that lived among the trees. Robert tried to teach them Portuguese words as they walked. He would point to things and say the Portuguese word, then the English word, tree, bird, water, sky. The 3 women were quick learners, especially Tani. She seemed to have a gift for languages, and by the end of the first week, she could form simple sentences combining Portuguese and English words. But as they got closer to civilization, things started to change. The jungle became less dense. They began to see signs of human activity, trails that had been cleared by machines instead of machetes, trash left behind by travelers. And the 3 women became more nervous. On the 8th day, they saw their first vehicle. It was an old truck parked on a dirt road, and the driver was sleeping in the front seat. Robert wanted to ask for a ride, but when the women saw the truck, they froze. Kaya actually gasped and grabbed Mira's arm. To them, this machine was like a monster, a huge metal beast that smelled terrible and made no sense. Robert had to coax them forward slowly. He walked up to the truck and touched it, showing them it was not alive, not dangerous. He knocked on the metal side so they could hear it was solid. Gradually, they came closer, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity mixed together. The driver woke up and was startled to see this strange group. A white man with a beard who looked like he had been living in the jungle for months, and 3 indigenous women who had clearly never been this close to civilization before. Robert explained in his rough Portuguese that they needed a ride to the nearest town. The driver looked suspicious, but when Robert showed him money, real Brazilian currency, the man agreed. Getting the women into the truck was another challenge. They did not understand doors or seats or seatbelts. When Robert climbed into the back of the truck bed, they followed him, sitting close together and holding on to each other. When the engine started, all 3 of them jumped and Tani let out a small scream. The noise was like nothing they had ever heard. As the truck began to move, the women clutched each other even tighter. The world was rushing past them faster than they had ever moved in their lives. Trees became blurs. The wind whipped their hair. Robert could see the terror on their faces, but also something else, wonder. Despite their fear, they were amazed by this impossible experience. The ride to town took 3 hours, and by the end of it, the women had relaxed slightly. They were still nervous, but they had realized that the truck was not going to hurt them. They even started to smile a little when they passed through particularly bumpy sections that made them bounce in the truck bed. But nothing could have prepared them for their first sight of the town. It was not even a large town by modern standards, just a small Brazilian municipality with maybe 10,000 people. But to Mira, Kaya, and Tani, it was overwhelming beyond description. Buildings. Dozens of buildings, some 2 or 3 stories tall, made of concrete and brick. Paved roads, electrical wires strung between poles, cars and motorcycles and bicycles moving in every direction, people everywhere. More people than they had probably seen in their entire lives combined. Signs with writing they could not read. Sounds, so many sounds. Horns honking, music playing, people shouting, machines humming. The women pressed together in the back of the truck, their eyes darting everywhere, trying to process what they were seeing. Robert could see they were close to panic. When the truck stopped, he helped them down carefully and kept them close to him. People on the street were staring at them, and Robert could understand why. The women still wore their traditional clothing, still had the faded marks of body paint on their skin, and looked completely out of place in this modern setting. Robert found a small hotel and negotiated for a room. The owner was reluctant until Robert paid double the normal rate. He led the women upstairs, and when they entered the room, they encountered more new things. Electric lights, a ceiling fan, beds with mattresses and sheets, a bathroom with running water and a toilet. The bathroom was particularly confusing. Robert had to demonstrate how everything worked: the sink, the toilet, the shower. When he turned on the shower and water came streaming out, Kaya actually screamed and ran to the corner of the room. She thought he had broken something and water was flooding the building. It took hours to help them understand these basic things. How to turn lights on and off with a switch. How to sleep in a bed instead of on the ground. How to use the toilet. How to turn on the faucet for water. Things that any child in the modern world knew instinctively were completely foreign and frightening to them. That night, Robert lay in his bed and listened to the 3 women talking softly in the other bed they were sharing. They refused to sleep separately, needing the comfort of each other's presence. He could hear the worry in their voices. They were in a world that made no sense, where everything was strange and nothing was familiar. The next morning, Robert's first priority was getting them proper clothing. Their traditional dress was attracting too much attention. He took them to a small store and bought simple clothes, shirts, pants, and shoes. The women had never worn shoes before, and they walked awkwardly at first, lifting their feet high with each step like they were walking through mud. Robert also needed to contact the American embassy and explain his situation. He found a phone in the hotel lobby and made the call. The conversation was difficult. How do you explain that you nearly died in the jungle, were saved by 3 indigenous women and then brought them out of the forest by essentially buying their freedom from their tribe. The embassy official on the phone was skeptical and concerned. This sounded like a potential trafficking situation. Robert would need to come to the embassy in person with the women and all his documentation. They would need to investigate before they could help him return home. Over the next 3 days, Robert and the women traveled by bus to the city where the embassy was located. The bus ride was another shocking experience for Mira, Kaya, and Tani. They saw landscapes change from jungle to farmland to city. They saw hundreds of vehicles on the highways. They passed through towns and cities that grew larger and larger. By the time they reached the city, the women were exhausted not just physically, but mentally. There was too much to process, too much that was new and strange. Robert could see they were reaching their limit. Tani had stopped asking questions and just stared blankly at everything. Kaya seemed to be in shock, barely responding to anything. Even Mira, the strongest of the 3, looked overwhelmed and uncertain. At the embassy, they spent hours being interviewed separately and together. Officials wanted to understand exactly what had happened, why it had happened, and whether the women were there against their will. Anthropologists were called in to speak with the women in related languages and verify their stories. Social workers assessed their mental state and well-being. It was exhausting and sometimes humiliating. The women were examined by doctors, questioned repeatedly about whether Robert had hurt them or forced them to come with him, and made to feel like they had done something wrong. Robert was questioned just as harshly. Had he kidnapped these women? Was he running some kind of scheme? What were his real intentions? Through it all, Robert had to remain patient and explain over and over again what had happened. He showed them Vicente's documentation. He told them about being saved by the women and how they were going to be abandoned by their tribe. He explained the trade and why it was the only option available. Finally, after 3 days of investigation, the officials reached a conclusion. While the situation was highly unusual and ethically complicated, they determined that no laws had been broken. The women were not being held against their will. They had chosen to leave their tribe and accept Robert's help. They were free to return to the jungle if they wanted, or they could continue with Robert to the United States. The officials asked the women directly what they wanted to do. Through translators, Mira answered for all 3 of them. Going back was not an option. Their tribe had exiled them. They would not be welcomed back, and even if they were, they did not want to return to a life where they were worthless. They wanted to go forward, to see what possibilities this new world might hold, even though it was frightening. With that settled, the embassy helped Robert arrange their travel documents. Getting passports and visas for 3 indigenous women who had no previous documentation was complicated. But eventually, it was done. They would be allowed to enter the United States under special humanitarian circumstances, sponsored by Robert, who would be responsible for them. 2 weeks after arriving at the embassy, Robert and the 3 women boarded an airplane bound for the United States. If the bus and trucks had been shocking, the airplane was beyond comprehension. The women held hands during takeoff, their faces pale with fear as the plane lifted into the sky. When they looked out the windows and saw the ground far below them, saw the clouds at their level, they could barely believe what they were experiencing. The cold hit them the moment they stepped off the plane in Montana. It was early autumn, and while it was not yet freezing, it was far colder than anything Mira, Kaya, and Tani had ever experienced. They had lived their entire lives in the tropical heat of the Amazon. They had never felt cold air like this, air that bit at your skin and made your breath visible. Robert had bought them jackets before the flight, but they did not really understand how to use them properly. He had to help them put the jackets on and zip them up. They stood on the airport tarmac, shivering and looking around at the mountains in the distance, the flat plains, the big sky that seemed to stretch forever. Everything was so open here, so different from the enclosed feeling of the jungle. Robert's wife, Patricia, was waiting for them inside the airport. Robert had called ahead to explain everything, though he knew a phone call could not really prepare her for what she was about to see. When Patricia saw him walking through the terminal with 3 indigenous women, her eyes went wide. She rushed forward and hugged Robert, crying because she had thought she might never see him again. Then she looked at the 3 women, and Robert could see her trying to process everything. He introduced them, speaking slowly. Patricia, These are Mira, Kaya, and Tani. They saved my life in Brazil. I'll explain everything, but right now they need our help. They need a place to stay, food, warmth, and time to adjust to being here. Patricia was a good woman with a kind heart, but even she looked overwhelmed. Still, she nodded and managed a smile for the three women. "Welcome," she said simply, knowing they would not understand the word, but hoping they would understand the gesture. The drive to the ranch was quiet. The women sat in the back seat of Robert's truck, pressed together as always, staring out the windows at this alien landscape. They saw cattle for the first time, cows so different from any animals they knew. They saw farmhouses and barns, fences stretching across fields, and roads that seemed to go on forever. When they arrived at the ranch, Robert showed them the guest house where they would be staying. It was a small building with 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bathroom. By American standards, it was simple. But to Mira, Kaya, and Tani, it was overwhelming luxury. Each bedroom had a real bed with blankets and pillows. The kitchen had a stove, a refrigerator, running water. The bathroom had hot water for showers. That first night, none of them slept well. The women were not used to the silence of the countryside, so different from the jungle's constant sounds. They were not used to the cold. They were not used to sleeping in separate rooms and separate beds. Around midnight, Robert heard movement and looked out his window to see the 3 of them leaving the guest house and walking together toward the barn. They had found a pile of hay and had all curled up together there, seeking the comfort of closeness and something that felt more like what they knew. Robert did not disturb them. He just made a note to bring them extra blankets in the morning. The next day, the trouble started. News travels fast in a small rural community, and within hours, everyone knew that Robert Harrison had returned from Brazil with 3 indigenous women. The phone started ringing, neighbors calling with questions, the local sheriff calling to make sure everything was legal, a reporter from the local newspaper asking for an interview. Robert tried to explain the situation to everyone who called, but the story was too complex, too unusual. People did not understand the context. They did not understand tribal customs or the impossible position the women had been in. All they heard was that Robert had essentially bought 3 women and brought them to Montana. Even when he explained that it was to save their lives, it sounded wrong to modern American ears. By the end of the week, there were protesters outside his ranch. A small group, maybe 20 people, carrying signs that said things like, "Human trafficking is wrong," and "Send them home." A local women's rights organization accused Robert of exploitation. A church group said he was destroying the women's culture and should have left them in the jungle. An indigenous rights advocate from a nearby university demanded to speak with the women to ensure they were not being held against their will. Robert felt angry and frustrated. He had expected some pushback, but he had not expected to be treated like a criminal. He let the indigenous rights advocate, a professor named Dr. Chen, visit and speak with the women through a translator. Dr. Chen spent several hours with Mira, Kaya, and Tani, asking them questions about their situation and their feelings about being in Montana. When Dr. Chen finished, she came out looking troubled but thoughtful. She told Robert that the situation was indeed complicated. The women were not being held against their will, that much was clear. They had chosen to come. But she was concerned about whether they truly understood what they had given up and whether they would be able to adapt to such a radically different culture. Dr. Chen gave Robert some advice. He needed to get the women proper support. They needed language teachers who could help them learn English. They needed cultural consultants who could help them understand American society while also helping them maintain their own identity. They needed mental health support because the trauma of such a dramatic change could be severe. And they needed legal representation to protect their rights and ensure they had options. Robert took her advice seriously. He used some of his savings to hire teachers who specialized in teaching English to adults. He found a therapist who had experience working with refugees and immigrants. He hired a lawyer to help the women understand their legal status and rights in America. And he reached out to anthropology departments at universities, asking for guidance on how to help the women maintain connection to their roots while adapting to their new home. The women themselves were struggling in ways that Robert had not fully anticipated. The food was all wrong. Patricia tried to cook things they might like, but nothing tasted right to them. They were used to simple foods like cassava, wild game, and foraged plants. American food with its spices, preservation methods, and different ingredients was strange and sometimes made them sick. The climate was torture for them. As autumn turned toward winter, the cold became intense. They had never experienced temperatures below 60 degrees in their lives. Now they were facing freezing weather, snow, and ice. They wore multiple layers of clothing and still shivered. The dry air made their skin crack and bleed. The short winter days depressed them, used as they were to consistent 12-hour days year-round. The language barrier was exhausting. They were learning English slowly, but every interaction was difficult. Going to the store was an ordeal. Watching television was confusing. Even simple things like using the telephone or understanding money were challenges that took weeks to figure out. And the culture shock ran deep. They did not understand why people lived in separate houses instead of together. They did not understand why Patricia did not have more children. They did not understand why people hurried everywhere instead of taking time. They did not understand waste, why Americans threw away so much food and so many things that could still be used. They did not understand privacy, the concept that people wanted to be alone sometimes. Tani cried often, usually late at night when she thought no one could hear. Kaya stopped eating properly and lost weight. Mira tried to stay strong for the others, but Robert could see the strain on her face. She had taken responsibility for this decision, for convincing the others to trust Robert. And now she worried that she had made a terrible mistake. The media attention got worse. A story about Robert and the women appeared in a regional newspaper, then got picked up nationally. Suddenly, journalists were calling from major news organizations. Talk shows wanted interviews. The story became a topic of debate online, with some people calling Robert a hero and others calling him a villain. Robert refused most media requests, but the attention was unavoidable. Strangers showed up at his ranch, some wanting to help, others wanting to protest, still others just curious to see the jungle women, as some people cruelly called them. Robert had to put up gates and hire someone to watch the property. Through all of this, Robert questioned himself constantly. Had he really saved these women? Or had he just traded one kind of suffering for another? In the jungle, they had been outcast and had no future. But at least they understood their world. Here they were lost and confused every single day. Was that better? He honestly did not know. 6 months in, things reached a crisis point. Kaya tried to hurt herself, taking pills from the medicine cabinet in a desperate act. Patricia found her in time and they rushed her to the hospital where doctors saved her life. When they brought her home, Kaya could barely look at anyone. Through the translator, she said she just wanted everything to stop. The new world was too much. She did not belong here. She would never belong here. She wanted to disappear. This shook everyone deeply. Robert realized they needed more than just English lessons and warm clothes. They needed real psychological support. They needed to find purpose and meaning in this new life. They needed to feel like they were not just lost foreigners, but people with value and potential. He brought in better mental health professionals. He connected with support groups for refugees and immigrants. 5 years passed. 5 years of struggle, growth, setback, and progress. 5 years that transformed 4 lives in ways none of them could have predicted that day, when Robert collapsed by a riverbank in the Amazon. Mira was the first to find her path forward. About a year after arriving in Montana, she attended a conference on indigenous rights at the university. Dr. Chen, the professor who had first visited the ranch, invited her to come and observe. Mira went reluctantly, still uncomfortable in large groups and unfamiliar settings. But something happened at that conference that changed everything. A speaker was talking about the challenges facing indigenous peoples around the world, about the loss of traditional lands, cultures, and languages. But the speaker had never actually lived in a tribe. They were speaking from research and secondhand knowledge. Mira listened for a while, then stood up and spoke. Her English was still rough, but she found words to explain what it was really like. She talked about the reality of being an outcast in your own community, She talked about the impossible choices people faced between preserving tradition and surviving in the modern world. The room went silent when she spoke. When she finished, people surrounded her with questions. They wanted to know more. They wanted to hear her perspective. For the first time since leaving the jungle, Mira felt like she had something valuable to offer. Her experience, her knowledge, her voice mattered. That moment started Mira's new life. Over the next 4 years, she became a powerful advocate for indigenous rights. Organizations invited her to speak at conferences, universities, and government hearings. She traveled across America and eventually internationally, telling her story and speaking about the complex realities facing indigenous peoples. She learned to use computers and social media to share her message. She worked with filmmakers to document traditional knowledge from various tribes before it was lost. She became a bridge between worlds, someone who understood both traditional tribal life and modern society, and could translate between them. But Mira never forgot where she came from. She used her platform to send resources back to Brazil, supporting programs that helped indigenous communities preserve their cultures while also accessing education and health care. She established a small foundation that provided scholarships for indigenous youth who wanted to learn to navigate between traditional and modern worlds. Kaya's journey was different, but equally remarkable. After her crisis in those first months, she spent a long time in therapy working through trauma and depression. It was during this time that she discovered something unexpected. She had always loved animals in the jungle, and at the ranch she was drawn to the cattle, horses, and dogs. Robert noticed this and suggested she might want to work with the ranch animals. At first, Kaya just fed them and cleaned their areas, but she showed such natural skill and intuition with the animals that Robert connected her with a local veterinary clinic. They were skeptical at first, but when they saw how Kaya could calm even the most agitated animals, how she seemed to understand what they needed, they agreed to train her. Kaya could not become a full veterinarian without years of schooling that her language skills were not yet ready for. But she became a veterinary technician, someone who assisted vets with examinations, treatments, and care. She was especially gifted with difficult animals, the ones that others struggled to handle. Her gentle approach and patience made her invaluable. She found peace in this work. Animals did not care about her past. They did not judge her for being unable to have children or for leaving her tribe. They just responded to her care and kindness. In the barn and at the vet clinic, Kaya found a place where she belonged. She also found something else. One of the veterinarians, a quiet man named Tom who had grown up on a ranch and never married, became her friend. It started with him teaching her medical procedures and her teaching him about plants from the Amazon that had medicinal properties. Slowly, carefully, a relationship developed. 4 years after arriving in Montana, Kaya married Tom in a small ceremony that blended both American and tribal traditions. She might not be able to have biological children, but she and Tom ended up fostering several children over the years, giving love and stability to kids who needed it. And then there was Tani, the youngest, the one with the scar, the one who had cried so much in those first terrible months. Her path was perhaps the most surprising of all. Tani had always been good with languages. She picked up English faster than Mira or Kaya. But more than that, she had a gift for teaching. As she learned English, she started helping other immigrants and refugees in the area learn too. She volunteered at a community center that provided services to newcomers. The director of the center noticed Tani's talent and encouraged her to get formal education. Tani was scared. She had never imagined going to school. But with support from Robert, from counselors, and from teachers who believed in her, she started taking classes at a community college. It was hard. There were many times she wanted to quit. Reading and writing in English were so difficult. Math was taught completely differently than the simple counting she had known. Science classes talked about the world in ways that contradicted everything she had learned growing up. But Tani persisted. She discovered she loved learning not despite her background but because of it. She could see connections between different ways of knowing that other students missed. She understood that there were many ways to be intelligent, many ways to solve problems. Her tribal education might not have included books, but it had included deep knowledge of plants, animals, weather patterns, and human nature. After 2 years at community college, Tani transferred to a university to study education. She wanted to become a teacher, specifically a teacher who worked with immigrant and refugee children. She wanted to help kids who felt lost between cultures, who did not fit in anywhere, who struggled with language and felt stupid because they did not know things that other kids knew. 3 years after starting university, Tani graduated with a teaching degree. The girl with the scar who had been considered unmarriageable and worthless in her tribe became a certified teacher in America. She got a job at an elementary school in a diverse neighborhood where many students came from immigrant families. Her scar, which had marked her as less than in her old life, became an asset in her new one. Kids who felt different, who felt marked by their own scars, whether physical or emotional, saw her and knew she understood. She was living proof that your past did not define your future, that who you were could be bigger than what others said you should be. Robert himself changed over those 5 years too. The experience had aged him, given him gray hair and worry lines he did not have before, but it had also given him perspective. He was no longer just a rancher focused on cattle and land. He had learned about cultures and worlds he never knew existed. He had learned that helping people was more complicated than just offering assistance. He had learned about the fine line between rescue and control, between helping and imposing. His relationship with Patricia had been tested. The stress of those first years, the media attention, the protesters, the financial burden of supporting 3 women and their education, it had all created tension, but they had worked through it. Patricia had grown too, becoming involved in refugee support networks and advocacy work she never would have discovered otherwise. The ranch itself had changed. Robert had converted part of it into a small education center that hosted cultural exchange programs. Students came to learn about sustainable farming, about different ways of living with the land, about building bridges between traditional and modern knowledge. Mira, when she was home from traveling, taught workshops there. Kaya brought school groups to learn about animal care. Tani brought her students for field trips. On a cool autumn evening, 5 years and 1 month after that first meeting in the jungle, the extended family gathered at the ranch for dinner. Robert and Patricia, Mira, Kaya, and Tom, Tani and her boyfriend who taught at the same school where she worked. Dr. Chen came, having become a close friend over the years. Vicente, the translator from Brazil, was visiting and joined them. They sat around a large table, eating food that was a mixture of American and Brazilian dishes, talking and laughing. The conversation flowed between English, Portuguese, and occasionally words from the tribal language that only Mira, Kaya, and Tani understood. At one point, someone asked Robert if he ever regretted his decision to go into that jungle all those years ago. He thought about the question carefully before answering. He said he regretted the arrogance that had led him there, the stubborn refusal to listen to warnings. He regretted the pain and struggle that the women had gone through in adapting to this world. He regretted that they had lost their home, their language, their connection to land and people they could never fully get back. But did he regret helping them leave when the alternative was death or a life of suffering? No. Did he regret that they were now free to choose their own paths, to build lives based on their own abilities and dreams rather than tribal hierarchies that had no place for them? How he turned to the 3 women. But it's not my opinion that matters, he said. You're the ones who live this.